Here we are. I always keep my promises, always. I'm A.M. Rebelny. I am a solution architect and host here on AWS On Air. We're bringing you live coverage from Reinforce, our security-focused event here in Boston. I'm joined with Farah and a wonderful guest, Lauren, too. Farah, please introduce yourself to everybody.
Hi, everyone. I'm Farah Campbell, Senior Product Marketing Manager at AWS with a focus on containers and serverless. Really excited to be here today and really excited to learn more about IP address management.
Yes. So my name is Lauren Finley, and I'm also a solutions architect, and I work with state and local government agencies for the state of New York, and typically I work with technical contract compliance. However, today I'm actually going to be talking to you guys about one of my favorite features that was released in reInvent of last year, which is VPC IPAM. So I'm very excited to talk to you guys about that today.
All right, Lauren, this is one of my favorite sessions that I do on air. It's one that I have no background in, so I'm going to be learning alongside our audience too. I am not a networking expert by any stretch of the means, more of an app dev background. So yeah, I mean, IP address management. I know some of the basics of I obviously know what an IP address is. I know that we use DHCP sometimes when you're inside a network that needs to go outside a network and doesn't have a dedicated IP. I know DNS. Where does IP address management come in? What is this?
So, AM, let me ask you this. How often do you use your GPS?
Oh, constantly.
Constantly?
This is a shout-out for my wife, Tay. She once asked
me. Who's amazing, by the way. She
great.
is.
Yeah.
To brag on her for a minute, she is pretty great. But yeah, she often asks me, what's it like? And when she says that, she means what's it like having no sense of direction, because I have no idea where I am at any point in time.
Guilty.
And she's literally could point north, south, east, west, wherever we are. So I'm heavily reliant on my GPS to answer your question.
Hey, I also have no sense of direction and heavily dependent on my GPS as well.
No sense of direction, team. That's me. I could pull into a 7-Eleven and pull out going the wrong way and not realize it. So.
But when you guys use your GPSs, how do you know where to go? Do you just have them all memorized? Do you have a notes app in your phone with all the addresses that you've stored over the years? How do you know?
The history or the contacts in my phone?
Well, typically you either look it up on the internet, right? Or you trust your GPS to pull up the address for you, right?
I definitely trust it, which that might lead me to some places that I don't want to go sometimes, actually. It has happened, for sure. I trust it to figure it out, and it didn't work, but yeah.
Well, sounds like you need a new GPS app on your phone.
Maybe so. Yeah.
But when it comes to using a GPS, IP address management operates these in the same way. An IP address is essentially an address for a IT resource that allows these resources to send and receive information from each other. So what we typically saw a lot of our customers were doing was storing all of these addresses in things like spreadsheets and other homegrown tools, which is fine if you only have a couple of addresses that you need to remember or a couple of phone numbers for your phone book. But when you start having hundreds and thousands and more than that IP addresses that you need to manage, it can get pretty crazy, and it can be very hard to scale if you're just scrolling through a list in your phone, right?
Yeah, that's a lot. So so customers would have thousands of IP addresses. How would you store those? I'm trying to figure out how do you keep
it up?
Like an Excel, I guess.
Exactly. That's exactly the solution that IPAM solves. So we would have situations where customers, for instance, if you had a developer who needed an IP address for a database, for an EC2 instance, they would have to send an email to whoever is managing that list or cut a support ticket, and it was pretty hard to scale and a lot of overhead. So our customers were asking us for a solution to help them better manage their IP address space, and that's where we created IPAM. So with IPAM, it makes it easy for you to plan, track, and monitor your IP addresses for your AWS workloads across all your accounts, all of your regions, and all of your VPCs within AWS.
Okay. That makes sense to me so far. I mean, this is a really nice analogy, actually. to help. I mean, do you see, Lauren, do you see maybe like some of the push to IPv6 too as one of the reasons that people are adopting an IPAM, because these are like truly unique, strings, and not IP addresses in a local, like IPv4 in a local network are sometimes reused, right? Like,
Right,
so,
right.
But that's not true for an IPv6 one. So they truly are unique and are going to be changing dependent upon your service and things like that. Is that a driving factor, maybe?
I would say that's another use case that IPAM helps solve.
Nice.
So it allows you to structure your IP addresses using hierarchical formats that allows you to create isolated IP address networks, so you don't have a lot of that overlap if you are currently using IP version 4 addresses with subnetworks that may have those collisions or overlaps. So we can talk a little bit about that more in just a minute. But yes, that is a use case that IPAM helps to solve.
Very cool. Yeah. So, do these services, I mean, I obviously know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask you.
Ask away.
A database, this is an area that I do know about. Like, your database.
Is that the question? What's a database?
Yeah, what is a database?
No.
What is it?
That's a whole nother session.
What is the thing? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I often do wonder, like, what are most of these things? They just seem to work, and I accept them as working. But no, when as an app dev, right? Oftentimes you have multiple IP addresses for something like a database, right? There's a reader endpoint, there's a writer endpoint, or just like to load balance, you have multiple IP addresses.
Yes.
So you just mentioned the hierarchical or organizational aspect of IPAM. Is that another way that I can utilize IPAM so that, I don't need to know each individual IP address for that service, and IPAM can help me figure out what IP address to use? Or is that beyond what an IPAM does?
I would say one of the actually unique features of IPAM, which I'm actually going to demo today for you is that IPAM allows you to track the historical usage of an IP address over time.
Oh, cool.
So if you update an Excel spreadsheet or an app in your phone, once that change is done, it's done. But with IPAM, it holds a record of whether this was an EC2 instance and then it moved to a database or it left your network. It'll actually store that information for up to 3 years. And you can it is integrated with CloudWatch too, so if you wanted to set alarms based on whether or not you're running out of IP addresses or whether or not IP address has changed, you can do that with IPAM. So you can use that functionality of IPAM to do troubleshooting. So let's say you had an IP address overlap that was causing a collision, and so you can check the historical records for an IP address to troubleshoot your network. So there's a lot of cool features that came from this IPAM service but I will be showing you guys that feature specifically in the demo.
Probably gives you better observability into like your IP usage though too. I mean, being able to see all that in CloudWatch, I imagine it's a lot easier to visualize it there than be looking in Excel to try and understand what's been changing. So.
Yes, exactly, Farah. And going back into the hierarchy, IPAM has a concept called pools, which allow you to assign a block of a CIDR range, which is just a notation for a group of IP addresses. But you can have a top-level pool, which you can further subdivide into a smaller pool, maybe based on region, US East 1, US East 2. Then you can further subdivide that pool into dev pool versus a prod pool. So you can continue to organize and manage your network from within AWS. And so that allows you to, one, have a more secure posture when it comes to managing your IP address space, but one of the other cool things about IPAM is you can actually track utilization. So another solution that this solves is if you start to run out of IP addresses. So like you said, with the IP version 4, there's limited amounts, and even if you assign a CIDR block range, if you start to run out, it can become, you can add more. There are ways you can add more, but with IPAM, by having a pool can have multiple CIDR block ranges allocated to it. So if you have a use case to have a, I'm slipping on the word, but have that ID to a CIDR range embedded into your script or into your code,
Right.
you would have to go update every time you update the CIDR block, right? Or change your network. However, if you have that to assign to a pool, that pool ID is never going to change. So you can add more CIDRs as you run out of IP addresses, and you won't have to go update any of your code, any of your scripts, because you can just use the pool ID now instead.
That's cool. So you're about to learn what I'm most famous for learning, and it is asking the obvious question that is probably a stupid question. That's like
There
my
are no
superpower.
stupid questions here.
Just stupid people, which that's me. No, I'm just
Hey,
kidding.
me too. Me too.
So again, this could be a very obvious question, and appreciate your patience with me in advance. Is an IPAM also used for allocating IP addresses? It sounds
Yes.
like you're actually
Yes.
assigning, hey, this CIDR block, you can go allocate IP addresses to things that are spinning up from this
Yes.
block, and you can like set that up with AWS services, or what? How do you allocate?
So with IPAM, you can automatically allocate IP addresses based on business rules you define. So whether
Okay.
that's certain IP addresses for certain regions or for certain accounts, or however you set it up when creating your IPAM. Even subnet sizes, like how big of a block of IP addresses do you want to be assigned when you create things like a VPC?
Wow.
You can set up all of that to be managed automatically by IPAM.
Okay. And so then when I go, create an EC2 in a specific subnet, and that has an IPAM associated to it, it knows to pull from this CIDR range.
Yep.
Wow.
Yes, that's
Okay.
exactly what I did today,
this
and
is
it's
the
actually
Obvious question.
Yeah.
I told you it's my superpower.
That's actually a perfect segue to our demo today, because that's exactly what I'm going to be showing you guys. So I have already created an EC2 instance and created that in a subnet that's in a network that's being managed by IPAM.
All right, so
And
we're gonna check that
show
out.
you guys what that
Awesome.
looks like in the console. All right, so if you've never logged into AWS before, this is what the AWS Management Console looks like. And the first service we're going to go to today is EC2, which stands for Elastic Compute Cloud. If you're unfamiliar with EC2, that's just your virtual compute within AWS, so your virtual server, essentially. Now, what I've done to prepare for this demo is I have this instance running called my IPAM EC2 instance. Very original, right? But if I click on the name of that instance, I can see all of the information about that instance below. But what I want to call your attention to is that I created it in a VPC that I created using IPAM. So it's being tracked and monitored by IPAM, as well as a
That's
subnet within that VPC.
Your IPAM VPC as well. I love the
My
practicality
IPAM
in naming.
VPC, my IPAM subnet, very original, I'm telling
No,
you.
it tells me exactly what it is. I love that.
Thank you. But what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to copy this IP address so that we can then go to IPAM and look at the historical insights for this EC2 instance. So I did just create this a couple of hours ago, so there's not going to be a lot of activity, but I just want to show you guys that the functionality is there. So if I type IPAM in the search bar, click on VPC, IP address manager, English. Real quick, if this is your first time going to VPC IPAM, you won't be greeted with the dashboard. You'll actually be greeted with this Getting Started page, which is very useful. It shows you step-by-step how it works, as well as the benefits and functionality of it. But what I want to show you guys real quick is that I created an IPAM here. And within that configuration, you have what are called scopes. Now, scopes are just containers that are that allow you to isolate your IP environment. So remember, you're talking about the IPv4.
Right.
If you have different networks that use the same IP address ranges, you can just create them in different scopes, and you won't have to worry about that overlap. So in this case, I have a public scope and a private scope, and we're going to be using the private scope today. With IPAM, I also can choose which regions I want it to cover. So I have it for this demo covering US East 1, US East 2. That's just how I designed the hierarchy. And then just the name here. And just to show you guys what a pool is, since we mentioned it before, I created one global pool for any region that I want to add. So one high-level pool, and then 2 sub-pools for US East 1 and US East 2 to further subdivide my environment. And I can see more information about that here. So whether or not the CIDR blocks have been allocated, the status, the region. I can also see the number of IP addresses here. Just tons of information. Oh, and going back to that utilization here, I can see I've used 88% of, or have not actually allocated IP addresses. I've just created subnets within this pool that have taken up about 88% of the IP addresses available. But you can see all of that information from within IPAM.
So other than having, like, how many IP addresses are still available and maybe being utilized, what are other reasons that developers need insights into their IP addresses?
It can be for compliance, it can be for troubleshooting, it can be for collision detection, it can be for a wide variety of use cases.
So there's a lot of things that this solves, it sounds like.
A lot of things,
Yeah.
all the things.
Yeah, all the things. All the things are being solved.
This is our security conference too. I work
Yes.
for a vulnerability management company, and part of running vuln scans on your infrastructure is often you have to connect over SSH or RDP to an instance, and you have to have a list of IP addresses that you want to scan. So again, this goes back to what you were saying, Lauren, is, is it good to have all those IP addresses in an Excel spreadsheet?
No,
It's better than
it is
nothing,
not.
but it's not the easiest thing to maintain. Like,
Right,
Yeah.
it is better than nothing, but I
Yeah.
can tell you IPAM is better than that.
Absolutely, yeah. And when you're then going to run your scans, you just pull from IPAM, it sounds like, a list of all the available IP addresses to go run your vulnerability detection against.
Yes, and I could show you that in another demo, but I do want to make sure I have time to show you
Please.
the historical insights, especially in the spirit of Reinforce, which is our security conference, just showing you guys how you can use that for logging, for auditing compliance. So that IP address that I copied from that EC2 instance, I'm going to paste that here in the search bar for the historical insights. Now, it does require you to use CIDR notation, which for a specific IP address, that's /32, so that's one IP address. And then I'm going to hit search. Now, I can see here information about the IP address that I entered. I can see when it was assigned. It's still assigned to that EC2 instance, so there's no end time for that. But I can see the resource ID. So if you want to track the actual ID an IP address that was assigned to, even if it's no longer allocated, that information is stored in IPAM for up to 3 years. So I can see, depending on the resource, you can have more data available as well. So if I were searching for a VPC, I could see the compliance status, do the IP addresses, or the subnets follow the business rules I defined in there. I can check if there's overlap. But in this case, it's just showing that I have an instance, so you can see the type of resource there too. But just for fun, let me actually get the CIDR range of the VPC so I can show you those metrics real quick. So if I paste in the CIDR for the actual VPC that EC2 was deployed in, I can see these other metrics here about the compliance status.
Wow.
I can see the resource for that one is a VPC, so you can know exactly what an IP address was within AWS.
Lauren, I feel like you pulled off a magic trick here. You made me understand something that I literally had no idea what it was coming in. All in the span of 20 minutes. Like, that's pretty incredible. thank you for joining us. Please come back. I would love to learn more from you. Farrah, thanks for sticking with me too. I think we've got some more sessions coming up together.
Yep.
But we'll